Some men wear silence like armor. He wore his like a challenge. From the moment he sat down, dark-skinned, sharply dressed, not a word wasted. The atmosphere around him began to shift. Not with noise, but with discomfort. Not because he was disruptive, but because he wasn't. It wasn't the seat he chose that unsettled them. It was the audacity of how well he fit into it. One look, and the crew decided he didn't belong. One question, and they made him a problem. A storm of bias gathered without warning. Small slights, veiled commands, rules enforced only for him. They laughed behind curt smiles, certain they knew the story. But they didn't know the man. What they saw was a target. What they dismissed was a trap. And when the truth finally broke, it wasn't loud. It was lethal. Like this kind of story? Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. What do you think the crew missed? And where are you watching from? Let's talk. Everett Darnell stepped onto Flight 394 with quiet purpose. He wasn't a man who made scenes. Every movement he made was efficient, deliberate. The result of years spent navigating rooms where the color of his skin always preceded the content of his character. Today, he wore a charcoal blazer that fit perfectly across his shoulders, a clean white button-down shirt, and slacks creased with precision. His carry-on was modest, a slim black messenger bag containing only what he needed, his laptop, a power cord, a USB drive with proprietary code, and a printed boarding pass that read clearly, First Class, Seat 3A. As he entered the first-class cabin, Everett offered a courteous nod to a middle-aged couple already seated in row 1. The air was thick with a scent of cologne, leather, and privilege. No one responded. He wasn't expecting them to. He found his seat by the window, stowed his bag in the overhead bin, and settled in. His laptop's battery warning blinked red. 6%. He would need power for the flight. He intended to review final specs for an infrastructure security pitch, one that, if accepted, would bring his company into a billion-dollar government project. It wasn't just important, it was mission critical. He glanced down to the power outlet embedded near his foot, tried plugging in a cord. Nothing. He adjusted it, double-checked the connection. Still dead. That's when he stood and made his way toward the galley, where a flight attendant was prepping drink trays. The man was tall, square-shouldered, and clean-cut, his hair buzzed tight, his name tag gleaming under the cabin light. Bryce. Bryce turned just as Everett approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with authority. "The outlet at my seat doesn't seem to be working," Everett said, gesturing calmly. "Would you mind taking a look?" Bryce tilted his head, looking Everett over, eyes lingering too long. "You in first class?" "Yes, 3A," Everett said, pulling his boarding pass halfway out of his pocket. "I just need a little charge. Laptop's near dead." Bryce grinned, but there was no humor in it. "First-class power's not for freeloaders," he said, loud enough for the closest 2 rows to hear. Everett's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry," I said, Bryce repeated louder this time. "Those outlets are reserved for paying customers. You sure you didn't wander in here by mistake?" The temperature seemed to shift. A woman 2 seats behind Everett looked up from her tablet. A suited man 1 row over lowered his newspaper. Everett felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken question in their eyes. Who is he? And what is he doing here? Everett remained composed. "I did pay," he said, voice low but steady. "I booked this seat myself. Weeks ago." "Must have been some promo deal," Bryce muttered. "DI initiative, maybe? You folks get those perks these days." Everett didn't respond. He felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck, but swallowed it. "Can you just check the outlet?" Bryce sighed dramatically. "I'll see if someone has a spare charger. You sure it's not just your equipment?" "I've tried multiple devices. The port's dead." Bryce leaned against the bulkhead. "Maybe you should have brought a power bank, buddy. Or sat where you belong." Everett blinked. He'd heard worse in boardrooms, cloaked in professionalism, in client meetings, peppered with faux politeness. But here, this was plain, ugly, unapologetic. "Excuse me," he asked, still calm. Bryce turned slightly, his voice now projecting toward the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "if anyone sees a laptop cord snaking across the aisle, please don't trip." "We've got a passenger who thinks he's in an internet cafe." Laughter trickled from the front row. A younger man in 2D chuckled and shook his head. "What's next?" he said to his seatmate. "Charging stations and free rides." Everett felt eyes on him. Dozens. Watching. Judging. Filming maybe. One passenger near the aisle subtly lifted a phone. Everett glanced at the seat pocket ahead of him, clenched his fists, then unclenched them. The outlet remained dead. So did the decency. The blonde flight attendant, early 20s, uncertain, approached with a tray of water glasses. She looked between Everett and Bryce, sensing tension. "Everything okay here?" she asked quietly. "Just a misunderstanding," Bryce said before Everett could speak. "Our guest here thought he was entitled to free power on top of everything else." Everett exhaled slowly. He knew this dance. Push too hard, and he'd be labeled aggressive. Say nothing, and the moment would pass with his dignity trampled. "Is there a manager I can speak to?" he asked. "About a power issue?" Bryce's smile vanished. "You want to file a complaint? Over an outlet?" "No," Everett said. "Over how I've been treated." "Big mistake, pal," Bryce said softly. "I've been doing this 20 years. You think they'll believe you over me?" Everett stared at him. "I think they'll believe the data on my laptop, but not if it dies mid-flight." Bryce snorted and walked away. "Better luck in coach." As Everett sat back down, the man across the aisle leaned over. "What was that all about?" he asked. Everett didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew none of them really wanted to know. They just wanted to feel better than him. Bryce passed by again, carrying a tray of warm towels. Bryce Henniger had returned to the galley with smug satisfaction, not bothering to hide the victory he felt after dressing down a man who had committed the audacious crime of asking to charge his laptop. Everett adjusted the tray table, opened his laptop again, and stared at the screen as the battery icon flashed 4%, a dwindling countdown to uselessness. He tried one more time to plug it in, even jiggling the cord gently, willing it to work. As he did, a shadow passed by, quick, heavy-footed. The cockpit door clicked open for a second as the co-pilot stepped out, stretching his legs. The man, about mid-30s with a square jaw and trimmed beard, glanced toward Everett. His eyes settled on the dangling charger. He gave a derisive snort. "What's he gonna do? Reroute the plane with that thing?" he joked, chuckling as he continued toward the lavatory. Several passengers nearby laughed, more freely now, more openly. One woman 2 rows ahead turned in her seat and whispered to her husband, "It's always a scene, isn't it?" Her voice wasn't hushed enough. Everett heard it. He heard all of it. Every dig, every chuckle, every sideways glance. They weren't mocking a request anymore. They were mocking him. The man. The black man in a first-class seat who was, in their eyes, asking for too much. The comment from the co-pilot opened a door, one that Bryce eagerly walked through. He returned moments later, wearing a performance of concern. "Sir," he said, voice falsely calm, "we're getting reports from a few passengers that you've been fidgeting with equipment." Everett looked up. "I've been plugging in my laptop." Bryce tilted his head, squinting in faux scrutiny. "We take aircraft tampering very seriously, Mr. Darnell." A few passengers gasped softly, some leaning into the aisles. Everett blinked, his pulse spiking. "Are you serious?" "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step away from your seat," Bryce continued. "This is now a safety matter." "Safety," Everett said, voice low. "You're turning a dead outlet into a federal threat." "Sir," Bryce raised his voice, "I won't argue. Stand up." Now, the authority in his tone summoned attention. Several passengers pulled out phones, lifting them discreetly, or not so discreetly. A teenager across the aisle was already recording. Everett saw the glint of a red dot on the screen. He looked at Bryce. "You're creating a scene over a power cord." "I'm following procedure," Bryce shot back. "I'm reporting suspicious behavior." A woman gasped. The term was loaded, deliberate. Suspicious behavior. On a plane. Attached to a black man. The implication was explosive. The accusation radioactive. "You can't be serious," Everett said again. "This is harassment." "This is policy," Bryce countered. "Unless you'd like to be met by airport police upon landing." For charging a laptop? Everett's voice cracked just slightly. I didn't touch anything but the outlet. That's not what the other passengers saw, Bryce said, gesturing vaguely. Everett glanced around. Nobody spoke in his defense. Nobody confirmed or denied. They simply watched. Some smug, some indifferent, some recording what they thought might go viral. I'll cooperate, Everett said at last, his voice stripped of its edge. But I want it on record that this is retaliation for asking for service I paid for. You're escalating, Bryce warned. Careful with your tone. Everett exhaled, pressed the laptop closed, and stood slowly. His knees brushed the tray. His bag remained stowed overhead. Where do you want me? Step back. Hands visible. You're not TSA, Everett muttered, but he obeyed. Two more crew members approached. One was Jolene McKinnon, an older attendant with red lipstick and sharp eyes. She whispered something to Bryce, who nodded. Escorting him to row 38, Bryce said aloud. Middle seat. That drew a few audible gasps. First class was barely half full, but they were marching him to the back of the plane, to the worst possible seat. Publicly, with intent. Everett grabbed his messenger bag from the overhead bin. Jolene moved to help, but Bryce shot her a look. She backed away. He had to carry it himself, past each row of silent witnesses, the shame pressing in like gravity. As he reached the divider curtain, a businessman in row 5D whispered, "Damn, couldn't you sit quiet, huh?" Everett didn't respond. He couldn't. Not without blowing up. Not without confirming the stereotype they all silently held. He walked past the galley, down the narrow aisle, bumping elbows and knees. The flight jolted slightly as he reached the final rows. Bryce gestured to a middle seat between two oversized passengers. "Right here," he said. "Enjoy the ride." Everett sat, cramped, boxed in. The man to his right had a wide gut and loud breath. The woman to his left had her elbow pressed against the shared armrest. There was no outlet here. No workspace. No dignity. Only punishment. Bryce leaned in slightly. "Next time, think twice before you start touching equipment." Everett stared straight ahead. He said nothing. Not because he had no words, but because in that moment, silence was his only armor. His heart pounded with rage, but he clamped it down. If he protested further, he'd be removed. If he resisted, he'd be restrained. If he showed his anger, they'd say he confirmed their fear. Behind him, the whispers spread. "Did you see how he looked at the crew? They said he was messing with wires. I heard the captain might come back." Everett breathed slow, focused. He was being dragged through humiliation like a criminal, and they were recording every step, not to help, but to capture a spectacle. Another nameless controversy to post and forget. He closed his eyes and felt the sting behind his lids. Not tears. Not yet. Just pressure. Every few minutes, a passenger would bump him as they squeezed through the narrow path, and the sharp chemical stench of disinfectant clung to the air. The cushion on his seat was visibly torn, the padding beneath sagging, and the recline function didn't work. As he tried to sit back, the seat snapped forward with a mechanical jerk, nearly throwing him into the tray table in front of him. He adjusted, trying to find comfort in a space designed for anything, but Bryce had followed him all the way back, ensuring he was properly relocated. And as Everett settled into the cramped seat, Bryce leaned in close enough for only him to hear and said, "Looks like a better fit to me." The smugness in his voice wasn't masked. It was intentional, barbed, personal. Everett didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly his molars ached. The woman seated beside him to the left wrinkled her nose and leaned away. On his right, the man shifted, pushing Everett closer to the middle. There was nowhere to move, no room to breathe, no semblance of dignity left in the way he sat. Bryce strolled back up the aisle, satisfied, while whispers continued to ripple through the passengers. Everett pulled out his phone, intending to record a short video, just something to document the abuse, to tell the story in his own voice. He switched the camera to front-facing, but before he could press record, Jolene McKinnon appeared, the older flight attendant who had silently enabled Bryce's actions earlier. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't apologetic. She crouched down beside him like someone about to deliver grave news. "Sir," she said, keeping her tone low, "I'm going to need to take that." Everett blinked, caught off guard. "Take what?" "Your phone," she replied, holding out a hand. "Why?" he asked. "I haven't violated any policy. Passengers aren't permitted to film crew members during an in-flight safety investigation," she said smoothly. "That's not FAA policy," he replied. "You're just making this up as you go." Jolene sighed. "Sir, I'm not going to argue. You've already caused a disruption." "No," Everett said, more firmly this time. "I've been silent. I've complied. I've been humiliated. That's not a disruption. That's survival." "Are you refusing to comply?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. Heads turned. A baby began to fuss 2 rows ahead. A man across the aisle lowered his earbuds. Everett exhaled, knowing the trap. "No," he said after a pause. "I'm not refusing. I'm handing this to you under protest. I expect it returned upon landing." He passed her the phone. Jolene nodded once, stood, and walked away. He didn't see where she placed it, probably locked in a drawer in the galley. The sensation of loss hit immediately, not just the phone itself, but the loss of a lifeline, a voice proof. He was now entirely at the mercy of people who had already decided he didn't belong. He slumped in his seat, eyes forward, trying to ignore the throbbing in his temples. He heard a teenage boy behind him mutter, "That's what happens when you get too big for your seat." Laughter followed. A group of college-age guys in sports hoodies chuckled. "Man should have kept his mouth shut," one of them said. Everett closed his eyes. He wasn't angry. Not at them. Not even at Jolene. He was angry at the system that enabled this, at how seamlessly it adapted its cruelty to the setting. In a courtroom, it was formality. In a boardroom, it was tone policing. Here, it was aviation protocol. Different masks, same face. A few rows up, Bryce stood chatting with another crew member, recounting the story with theatrical flair. Then he tried to claim the seat was his. Bryce said, laughing, "Flash some boarding pass, like that proves anything. Like we don't know who buys what." The other crew member shook her head. "They're always pulling that card." Everett wasn't supposed to hear them, but he did. And so did others. But no one said a word. No one intervened. No one defended him. This was the cruelty that wore a smile and called itself procedure. When the drink cart finally arrived, Jolene wasn't behind it. Instead, a younger male attendant pushed it down the aisle. Everett asked for water. The attendant paused, consulted a tablet, then replied, "Sorry, sir, no beverage service authorized for your seat number." Everett stared at him. "Excuse me. I've been instructed not to serve your row," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." The cart rolled away. Everett turned his gaze toward the ceiling, the little plastic nozzle pumping recycled air into his face. It wasn't cooling. It was suffocating. 2 hours to go. 2 hours of this confinement, this enforced invisibility. He felt the ache in his back where the seat refused to support him. His feet pressed against the bag under the seat, his only comfort. The smell from the lavatory seeped out every time the door swung open. He heard the toilet flush constantly, every few minutes, like a reminder of where they had placed him. Not just in proximity, but in priority. Down here, near the waist, near the hum of engines and metallic clatter of carts. He wasn't just excluded, he was discarded. A young girl walked past with her mother and stared at him curiously. Her mother tugged her along gently. "Don't look," she whispered. Everett watched them go, then turned toward the window. Clouds obscured the view, blank whiteness all around. Above them, in first class, his charger still lay coiled uselessly in the seat he had paid for. His laptop, tucked beneath his feet, was now dead. All the notes, the code, the pitch silenced. A few more chuckles rippled down from mid-cabin. Someone mentioned his name. Someone said, he should be grateful we even let him fly. Jolene had taken it in the name of some fictitious airline policy, and since then, no crew member had acknowledged him or made an effort to return it. Every minute that passed without his device widened the gap between him and the proof he needed, the proof that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he wasn't a threat, that he was just a man trying to finish his work in peace. But in the logic of this flight, his compliance had been rewritten into aggression, his stillness into resistance, and his silence into guilt. The woman to his left kept leaning away from him like his presence might infect her seat. Her arm had migrated fully onto his armrest, and her eyes were locked on her phone screen, even though the cabin crew had supposedly asked for electronics to be stowed. The man on his right had shifted positions, crossing his arms and facing slightly away from Everett, as if to say, "You're not part of this cabin." The stares had evolved. They were no longer curious glances, but studied gazes, as if Everett were an exhibit on display, some specimen in a lab, a case study in misbehavior. He could feel it everywhere. The weight of judgment, the intentional isolation, the complete removal of dignity that came not in a single blow, but in 1,000 small incisions. Then, just above the mechanical hum of the engines, the cabin intercom clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight crew," a voice announced. It was Bryce. Everett recognized the smirk in the tone even before the words formed. "For the safety of all our passengers, please be advised that any suspicious activity or noncompliance with crew instructions will not be tolerated. We're aware of a recent disturbance in the cabin and are monitoring the situation." Everett's chest tightened. There it was, carefully worded, tactically vague, but unmistakably pointed. A public warning broadcast to every person aboard, framing him as the disturbance, the outlier, the variable that required watching. He wasn't a man in seat 38B anymore. He was the warning. He was the coded threat now embedded in the flight's narrative. Passengers looked up from their screens. Some whispered. Others turned fully in their seats to glance back toward him. Everett locked his jaw and kept his eyes forward. The words echoed in his mind, monitoring the situation. They were trying to box him into submission, not physically, because that was already done, but psychologically. By redefining his presence as a risk, they were inviting everyone to police him, to doubt him, to anticipate a failure that he hadn't even hinted at. He wanted to scream, not out of rage, but to reclaim his voice, to pierce the calm cruelty of their manipulation. But screaming would only confirm their narrative. They didn't need facts. They needed a reaction. He wouldn't give them one. An older man 2 rows ahead stood and approached a flight attendant. Everett couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the attendant nodding, gesturing subtly toward his row. The man glanced back at Everett, squinted, then returned to his seat. 10 minutes later, another woman flagged down a crew member and spoke in hushed tones while motioning in Everett's direction. He felt like a marked item, like an alert had been triggered in the cabin, and every whisper now fed a growing chain of suspicion. He folded his arms across his chest, not in defiance, but to control the small tremor in his hands. The injustice of the moment wasn't just about the insult anymore. It was about erasure. They weren't just pushing him back physically. They were attempting to rewrite the truth of the situation, turning him from a customer into a threat. A junior attendant passed through the aisle and offered cookies to everyone in the back row. When he reached Everett, the tray tilted, and a single cookie slid to the edge before the attendant pulled the tray away. No offer, no acknowledgement, just a glance that said everything. "You've already taken enough." Everett looked down at his hands, at the dry lines across his palms. He thought about his team waiting back in Chicago, about the project plan due at midnight, about the code still sitting on his now-dead laptop. He thought about his reputation, the image he had spent years building with care, only to be dismantled in a few hours by people who saw his calmness as arrogance and his requests as defiance. The injustice was surgical, clean. There would be no bruises, no visible scars. Just a man escorted from his paid seat, publicly warned, digitally silenced, and treated as an anomaly. A few rows up, Bryce reemerged, strolling down the aisle with an air of unearned confidence. He stopped halfway down, scanning the back of the cabin. His eyes landed on Everett. He offered a smile, tight-lipped, superior theatrical. Then he continued walking. Everett didn't look away. He watched Bryce's every step, memorizing the cadence of his manipulation. He would remember this moment, not as a humiliation to be buried, but as a receipt to be paid back. The curtain dividing economy from first class fluttered as someone exited the lavatory. Everett realized it wasn't just about where he sat now. It was about how they had trained everyone to see him. Not as Everett Darnell, CTO of one of the fastest growing tech firms in the nation, but as the guy in the back, the one they warned us about. That shift was invisible, but enormous. It meant every word he said, every breath he took for the rest of this flight would be filtered through a distorted lens of suspicion. The touchscreen was laggy, unresponsive at first, but finally it blinked to life. He scrolled past the menu options, through the movies and TV shows he had no interest in, and found the Wi-Fi tab. The airline offered a limited connection package, with options to message or check email. Desperate for any tether to the world beyond this flying prison, Everett attempted to connect. He selected the email option, keyed in his information manually, and watched the wheel spin. Then came the error message. Access restricted. Please see a flight attendant for details. He tried again. Same result. He exited the screen and opened it anew, selected the basic messaging package. Another block. User access disabled. He frowned, tried once more, but the same message returned. There was no mistake. His profile had been flagged. His access denied. The isolation wasn't just physical. It had now been digitally codified. They hadn't just taken his phone. They had cut every line connecting him to assistance, to evidence, to recourse. His brows furrowed as he leaned slightly into the aisle, attempting to catch the attention of a passing attendant. A woman in a navy vest approached, polite smile fixed to her face. "Ma'am," Everett said calmly, "my in-flight Wi-Fi access is blocked. I'd like to speak to someone about restoring it." Her smile tightened. "Let me check," she said, tapping on the tablet in her hand. Her fingers danced across the screen, and she squinted. "I'm sorry, Mr. Darnell. You've been temporarily restricted from network services due to earlier issues logged by the crew." "What issues?" he asked. "Using my laptop?" "I'm not permitted to discuss it," she said. "You can reach out to customer relations after the flight." "Which I can't do," he replied evenly, "because you've taken my phone and blocked me from access." She offered a well-practiced apology and moved on. The man seated in front of him, maybe in his 50s, turned around slightly and muttered, "Rules are rules, man. You made your bed." Everett didn't respond. He just stared at the headrest in front of him, the cheap vinyl surface wrinkled from years of use, and thought about how fast the system could flip. Just 2 hours ago, he was a paying customer with a first-class boarding pass and a purpose. Now he was a digital ghost, a security risk, a problem. He glanced across the aisle and noticed a young white man, early 20s, relaxed with his feet up against the divider. He had his phone out and was typing with ease. Everett could clearly see the screen open to Gmail. The man chuckled to himself as he typed, then said to his seatmate, "Told you I'd get that pitch in before landing." Everett's jaw tightened. He had been stripped of everything, access, communication, standing. Yet here was someone else, connected, empowered, working freely. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was strategy. They weren't applying rules. They were weaponizing them. A few minutes later, Bryce returned from the front cabin. He walked slower now, casually, his hands behind his back like an officer inspecting a lineup. He stopped near Everett's row, looked around, then bent slightly to speak to the crew member standing by the lavatory. "He's still behaving?" he asked, not bothering to whisper. "Hasn't tried anything else?" The crew member nodded. "Just asked about the Wi-Fi." Bryce smirked. "No one's going to believe him anyway," he said, too loud for discretion. "He's just another entitled case." Everett's fists clenched in his lap, every muscle in his arms screaming for release. Entitled. That word hung in the air like poison. It was always the word they used to reverse the story, to imply that wanting fairness was arrogance, that demanding dignity was overstepping. He turned his head slightly and met Bryce's gaze. The attendant didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a victorious, venomous expression, and walked away. The crew member who had been listening gave Everett a glance that wasn't pity but calculation, like she was mentally adjusting her risk assessment based on Bryce's words. The box they were building around him was airtight. No phone, no internet, no voice, and now no credibility. It didn't matter what happened from here. In their eyes, the narrative was set. He was difficult. He was a liability. He was something to manage, not someone to serve. A baby cried 2 rows ahead, and the sound pierced through the cabin like a warning siren. Everett didn't even flinch. The noise was just another part of the atmosphere. Now, one more piece of chaos outside his control. He stared down at his knees, at the frayed edge of his pant leg, and tried to remember the last time he had felt human on this flight. Before the outlet, before the snide comment, before the march of humiliation. Somewhere in that sequence, they had stopped seeing him, and in return, he was starting to feel himself disappear. Not in anger, in erasure. They weren't trying to defeat him, they were trying to unmake him. And worse, they were doing it with ease. Not one person had intervened. Not one person had asked if he was okay. Not one had questioned the absurdity of a professional man being silenced, relocated, and blocked from digital access for merely asking to charge a device. He was no longer just a passenger. He had become an absence, a blank to be ignored, a non-person engineered by whispers and reinforced by silence. Every system designed to offer service and inclusion had now been weaponized to remind him he didn't belong. The flight attendants moved with mechanical precision, doling out meals and drinks in a practiced rhythm. Carts rolled, trays clinked, and conversations rose and fell around him like waves. When they reached his row, the cart stopped short. The attendant consulted a list on a tablet, then looked right over his head. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked the woman beside him, who selected her meal with a frown of mild indecision. The man to Everett's right received his tray next, muttering thanks. Then the cart moved on. No offer, no glance, nothing. Everett waited a few seconds, then cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. The attendant paused, looked back with the expression of someone recognizing a problem, not a person. "Yes." "You skipped me," Everett said plainly. "I'd like to request a meal, whatever's available." She stared at him for a beat, then gave a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not listed for meal service." "But I'm in the same row," he replied. "I'm not sure how that's possible." "It's policy," she said, then turned away, pushing the cart down the aisle before he could speak again. The woman next to him glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. "Guess you didn't pay for the upgrade," she said, adjusting her tray. Everett exhaled slowly, each breath deliberate. The man on his other side chuckled, not bothering to look up. "Maybe he's on parole or something," he muttered. "That would explain the crew's attitude." "Or maybe he's hacking Delta," someone said from behind them, followed by stifled laughter. Everett didn't react. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed to stand, to speak, to remind them all who he was and what he represented. But the truth was bitter. Here, in this space, stripped of tools and credibility, he was whatever they decided he was. The narrative had already calcified. He was the disruption. He was the risk. He was the one to watch. Every joke, every dismissive glance, every denial of basic service was a confirmation of their roles as enforcers of that story. Another attendant passed with a tray of beverages. As she approached, Everett raised a hand. She didn't slow down. He called out, "Miss?" She stopped, turned with affected politeness. "Yes." "May I have a glass of water?" "We've already passed your row," she said, looking at the other passengers for support. "I'm sure you can wait." "It's water," he said, biting back frustration. "It's not a premium request." "I'll see if there's any left after we finish the next section," she replied, walking away without a second glance. The passengers around him resumed their conversations, the rejection normalized by the silence of complicity. It wasn't just that he was being mistreated, it was that everyone else had accepted it as appropriate, even justified. That was the true violence, not in the skipped meals or denied Wi-Fi, but in the complete surrender of those who watched it happen and chose not to act. He shifted in his seat, the broken cushion pressing awkwardly against his spine. The air was growing stuffy, laced with the smell of reheated food and stale upholstery. His body ached, not from turbulence, but from the effort of containment. Every muscle was clenched in resistance to an explosion that would only prove them right. He thought about the woman he was supposed to call tonight, the attorney who had helped him draft the protections around the upcoming software deal. Without access to his files, his notes, or even a single email, he was unarmed. His silence wasn't submission, it was survival. A few rows up, someone sneezed. A flight attendant offered tissues immediately. A baby cried 2 seats behind him, and a passenger was offered noise-canceling headphones. But Everett, sitting quietly, asking for water, for food, for respect, received nothing. He watched as crew members laughed with other passengers, accepted compliments, traded stories about hotel points and vacations. It was the casual comfort of people who knew the system bent for them, who understood, maybe even unconsciously, that this man, this outlier seated among them, was now an expendable anomaly. Bryce passed through again, and this time, he didn't even pretend not to notice Everett. He slowed just enough to smirk, then leaned slightly toward a nearby crew member. "They always think they're owed something," he said. "You give them an inch." His voice trailed off into a laugh. The weight pressing down on him was no longer just social. It was strategic. This wasn't about rudeness. It was design. He had become the vacuum into which everyone's assumptions were funneled. He was no longer Everett the man, Everett the tech executive, Everett the innovator. He was Everett the threat, the disruption, the other. And he knew it. He had known it for years. But what they didn't know, what they never seemed to understand, was that Everett had learned to live with that silence. And in that silence, he had built power, true power. And now, as his muscles ached from sitting rigid, as his stomach tightened from skipped meals, as thirst dried the back of his throat, he felt a shift ripple through the air around him. Quiet as a whisper, but sharp as a blade. A flicker of movement caught his eye. From the front of the economy cabin, a figure approached. It was Nia, the youngest of the flight attendants. Black, nervous, observant. She moved down the aisle with cautious precision, holding something clutched in her hand. Everett didn't move as she stopped beside him. She didn't kneel or lean in close like the others did to exert control. Instead, she looked directly at him, her expression conflicted. Then she spoke, low and steady. "I found it," she said, and she handed him his phone. Everett blinked. The weight of the device in his hand felt heavier than it should have, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. His voice, his connection, his evidence. "Why aren't you furious?" Nia asked, her voice trembling. "After everything they've done to you." He looked up at her, calm, measured, as composed as ever. And then he spoke just loud enough for her to hear, but with a clarity that made her freeze. "Because they're about to lose everything." Nia's breath caught. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood there, eyes wide, watching him as he unlocked the device. He didn't rush. He moved deliberately, efficiently, typing out a single command string into a secure app masked behind what appeared to be a calculator. One press, one silent signal. It was done. The transmission shot into encrypted satellites overhead, bouncing through 4 continents before landing in the executive servers at Sole Access Systems, the cybersecurity empire Everett had helped build from nothing. The alert was non-reversible, time-stamped, authorized. The response would be automatic. Fail-safes he had designed months ago for this very scenario began unraveling in the background. He returned the phone to airplane mode and looked up. Nia still stood there, frozen in her own silent war between fear and understanding. "They think I'm powerless," he said, his voice a breath. "Let them." She nodded slowly, then turned without a word and returned up the aisle. 10 minutes later, small anomalies began to surface. The passenger in seat 22C tried to order another cocktail on the in-seat screen and was met with an error message. Transaction failed. Internal server block. At the front, a businessman in 1A tried to access the in-flight conference feature, but was booted to a static screen. Then it spread. Wi-Fi across the cabin shut down, not just for Everett, but for every device on board. Credit card transactions stopped working. Streaming froze mid-frame. And within the cockpit, The auxiliary systems tied to Solaxis's cloud interface, passenger logs, in-flight meal tracking, real-time weather routing, all began reporting critical failures. Panic didn't erupt instantly. That would come later. For now, the crew exchanged confused glances. Bryce walked briskly up and down the aisles, tapping his tablet that no longer responded. Jolene returned to the front, stiff-lipped, whispering heatedly into the cabin phone. In the rear, flight attendants fiddled with screens and quietly asked each other whether it was a system update. Everett remained still, silent, watching, letting them stew in the confusion of a world built on control beginning to crack. Behind the curtain in first class, the atmosphere shifted. A senior executive, someone high up, Everett knew instinctively, stood and made a call on an encrypted airline satellite phone. But the signal was already compromised. The call dropped. When it reconnected, it routed through a delay. Everett watched the dominoes fall, one by one. Then came the voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a brief systems disruption. Please be patient while we work to restore full functionality." The lie rolled off their tongue, but the lie wouldn't last. A crew member approached Everett again, this time not with dismissal, but with uncertainty. "Sir," she said, may I ask if you've had any access to in-flight systems?" The question was phrased carefully, designed to avoid accusation. Everett looked at her, unblinking. "No," he said simply. It wasn't a lie. He hadn't accessed their systems. He'd simply turned off his own. The Solaxis architecture that supported the airline's entire in-flight tech suite was a leased platform, one Everett personally oversaw. It operated on a series of keys, a network of secure protocols that, when revoked, initiated a cascade of controlled shutdowns. Redundancies would keep the plane flying, but everything else, the luxury, the convenience, the commerce, would fade. That's what he had done. The Solaxis failsafe he'd triggered wasn't designed to endanger. It was a diagnostic power down, a full-spectrum lockout used only in instances of security breach. What none of them knew, what none of them had thought to consider, was that the man they'd ridiculed, removed, and rendered voiceless had architected every line of the code, now pulling their systems into lockdown. His name wasn't just on the passenger manifest. It was etched into the infrastructure of their entire flight. In the cockpit, the captain stared at the error messages flooding the control screens. Not the flight instruments, which remained unaffected, but the communication tools, in-flight passenger database, meal logs, and transaction servers. All flickering with the same root-level failure. With growing urgency, the captain toggled the radio to contact ground control, his voice even but clipped. "Delta Flight 394, requesting immediate systems advisory. We are experiencing a cascading software lockout affecting passenger interface systems, meal service modules, and auxiliary functions. Primary flight systems unaffected. Request status from tech services." Static met him for a beat, then a clipped response crackled in. "Standby 394. Confirming disruption with Solaxis system support." The line went silent for 30 seconds. Then came the voice again, slower now. "Delta 394, confirm you have a Mr. Everett Darnell aboard. Please verify immediately." The captain blinked, caught off guard. "Say again." "Everett Darnell, CTO of Solaxis Systems. Our logs show he triggered the override protocol on board. Is he on your manifest?" The co-pilot looked up from the list and paled. "He's in the cabin," he said slowly. "Row 38, CP." The silence that followed was dense with realization. Ground control continued. "You're advised to de-escalate immediately. This incident has reached corporate escalation. Crew is advised to approach with professionalism and be prepared to issue an apology." The captain turned to his senior flight officer, tight-lipped. "Get Henniger and McKinnon to the front. Now." Moments later, Bryce and Jolene stood shoulder to shoulder inside the cockpit galley, visibly confused. Bryce's arms were crossed defensively. Jolene clutched her tablet, which had long since lost functionality. "What's going on?" Bryce asked. "We've got a passenger issue, system crashes. That passenger is Everett Darnell," the captain interrupted, his voice sharper than they'd ever heard it. CTO of Solaxis. You know, the company that provides our onboard tech? He's the reason nothing's working. Because you dragged him into coach and humiliated him. Jolene blinked hard, her cheeks draining of color. That can't be he was filming, refusing instructions. He was sitting in the seat he paid for, the captain snapped. You escalated a customer complaint into a public incident, then stripped him of access, violated FAA policy by confiscating a device without incident authority, and now we're flying blind on everything short of controls because you humiliated the man who owns the keys to our systems. Bryce's posture changed instantly, arrogance evaporating into visible discomfort. We didn't know. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, the captain said. You don't get to interrogate someone for being black in a blazer who dares to ask for power in first class. Bryce opened his mouth, then closed it. The captain waved them off. Fix this. Now. Start by getting him his seat back. Minutes later, Everett looked up as Bryce and Jolene approached. Gone was the mockery. Gone was the superiority. Now their movements were slow, deliberate, deferential. Jolene knelt slightly beside his seat, her voice soft. Mr. Darnell, she said, we're terribly sorry for the earlier misunderstanding. We'd like to offer you your original seat in first class and extend our deepest apologies on behalf of the crew. Everett looked at her, then at Bryce, who couldn't quite meet his eyes. The silence between them stretched. Around them, passengers strained to listen, sensing the shift in tone. You want me to move back? Everett asked evenly. Bryce nodded. Yes, sir. We'd like to make things right. You mean you want to reinsert me into a space you kicked me out of for daring to use a power outlet? Everett's voice was calm, but each word landed with steel. Now that you know who I am, Jolene swallowed hard. Yes, sir. It was a mistake. No, he said. It was policy. Your policy. Until now. The aisle was silent. Passengers stared. Everett sat still for a long moment. Then he shook his head. I'll stay here, he said. Passengers who once whispered jokes and filmed Everett Darnell's public embarrassment were now watching him, with wary silence or nervous guilt. Their phones buzzing with notifications. Social media feeds lit with the first flames of what would become a national wildfire. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, Everett stood slowly. No dramatic gestures, no lingering stares, just calm, precise movement as he retrieved his bag from the overhead. Passengers in surrounding seats moved instinctively, not just to give him room, but as if in recognition that they were in the presence of someone they had gravely misjudged. As he stepped into the aisle, the teenager who had once smirked at his removal lowered his phone and mumbled, "Sorry, man." Everett didn't respond. The apology wasn't his to accept. He passed row after row, each passenger's eyes tracking his movement, some recording again, now unsure of which narrative they wanted to own, outrage, allyship, or apology. As he reached the front of the aircraft, Bryce and Jolene stood stiffly near the exit door, uniforms neat, faces pale. Neither spoke. Jolene tried to meet his eyes, but Everett didn't look at her. He stepped past them without pause, without vindication, because his justice had already begun to unfold. By the time his shoes touched the terminal floor, the footage from the flight had already breached the walls of social media anonymity. A college student seated 4 rows ahead had posted a 2-minute video of Everett's forced removal, accompanied by the caption, "First class, while black. Delta, care to explain?" Within 10 minutes, the video had racked up 20,000 views. By 30 minutes, it hit 500,000. By the time Everett reached the rideshare curb, hashtags like #DeltaDisgrace and #EverettDarnell were trending globally. Screens inside the terminal showed breaking headlines on CNN, MSNBC, and tech outlets like Wired and TechCrunch. The incident wasn't just a story about customer mistreatment. It was a catastrophe for Delta's corporate image, especially after it was confirmed by a leaked email from a Solaxis executive that the man in question was indeed the company's chief technology officer. That revelation exploded like a detonation through media channels. Reporters scrambled to gather statements. Think pieces flooded the internet. Business analysts began speculating what the cost of such public relations negligence might be. The answer came hours later, when Solaxis Systems released a formal statement. Effective immediately, Solaxis Systems is terminating all technology service contracts with Delta Airlines due to gross misconduct involving our executive leadership during flight operations. This decision includes the withdrawal of digital support infrastructure for in-flight services, passenger databases, cloud-based scheduling, and future AI-integrated operations. We do not tolerate institutional discrimination. Our systems were built to empower, not to enforce prejudice. The contract, worth $2.6 billion, had been central to Delta's transition into a fully digitalized aviation model. Its loss sent stock prices plummeting by 8% overnight. Investors demanded accountability. The board convened emergency meetings. Within 12 hours of landing, Delta's CEO issued a public apology. "We are deeply troubled and ashamed by the treatment Mr. Darnell endured on our aircraft. This behavior does not represent our values. We are cooperating fully with Solaxis Systems and have initiated a complete internal investigation." But it wasn't enough. Employees began leaking internal memos showing that Everett's experience wasn't unique, that first-class discrimination complaints from Black and minority passengers had been quietly dismissed for years. A second wave of outrage struck. Lawsuits were filed. Civil rights groups called for federal investigations. Bryce and Jolene were placed on indefinite unpaid suspension, pending the outcome of multiple internal and external reviews. Photos of Bryce in uniform circulated online, paired with snippets of the cruel phrases he had muttered. "Better fit in the back. No one will believe him." The backlash was swift. Bryce's LinkedIn was flooded with comments. His previous employer issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. Jolene's previous passenger evaluations were unearthed, revealing patterns of targeted hostility toward specific demographics. A third-party audit was ordered by the Department of Transportation. Meanwhile, Everett said nothing. He didn't post. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't retaliate. He returned to his office, continued his work, and answered only to one source: action. A week after the incident, a photograph circulated. Everett at a conference, standing beside other executives at a technology forum discussing ethics in artificial intelligence. Someone had captioned it simply: "The man they tried to silence is writing the code that will outlive them." Behind the scenes, Everett's legal team prepared filings not just against Delta, but against individual employees who had participated in the incident. His firm retained top-tier civil rights attorneys. A federal lawsuit alleging racial discrimination, defamation, unlawful detainment, and violation of digital property rights was filed in the U.S. District Court. As media coverage intensified, more passengers from Flight 394 came forward, offering affidavits and corroborating Everett's treatment. The teenager who had filmed parts of the incident testified that he heard Bryce accuse Everett of tampering with systems without cause. Another passenger, a woman in her 60s, submitted a statement saying she felt deeply ashamed for not speaking up. In a rare move, Everett's company created a public-facing timeline of the digital events on board the flight, demonstrating precisely when and how he activated the protocol that led to the system shutdown. The logs showed timestamps, authorization codes, and system responses, making clear that his action had been measured, controlled, and necessary. Public opinion rallied hard. Hashtags turned into campaigns. Activists used the story to call attention to systemic inequalities not just in aviation, but across industries. Everett's name became shorthand for quiet resistance. He didn't need slogans. His restraint had become his roar. And through it all, Delta struggled to contain the fallout. 6 months passed. The season had turned from the raw cold of February to the soft bloom of late summer, but the echo of what had occurred on Flight 394 had not faded. The story had grown beyond a single incident. It had become a symbol, a cultural checkpoint where arrogance was exposed, truth endured, and silence became power. Everett Darnell, once publicly humiliated, now spoke before global audiences not to recount his ordeal, but to teach from it. He had released a book titled Corporate Ethics: Power, Accountability, and the Cost of Silence, and within days of publication, it climbed the bestseller charts in multiple countries. His words were not angry. They were direct, measured, and filled with the sharp clarity of a man who knew the cost of being unheard. Across the industry, policies changed. Airlines rewrote their passenger treatment protocols. Mandatory equity training became not just a box to check, but a matter of survival in a marketplace newly aware of its faults. Solax's systems surged in value. Their new initiative, Code with Conscience, became a leading standard in ethical tech development. Everett continued to lead the company, but devoted time to mentoring a new generation of executives who understood that leadership without empathy was simply tyranny in disguise. Meanwhile, those who had once enforced that tyranny walked a very different path. Bryce Henniger now worked as a contract security officer at the same airport where he once strutted through gates in a flight crew uniform. The badge he wore clipped to his belt was not made of gold-plated wings, but of laminated plastic, and the authority it represented extended only to bags and belts and bins. The high-traffic morning rush had just begun when Everett entered the terminal, dressed in business casual and carrying nothing but a briefcase and a single copy of his book. The line moved swiftly. Everett approached the checkpoint. Bryce, now leaner, older in posture if not in age, stood scanning boarding passes with an air of subdued professionalism. He looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, the space around them paused. Recognition passed through Bryce's face like a storm cloud. Regret, embarrassment, a flicker of fear. He straightened. "Good morning, sir," he said, voice neutral. Everett smiled faintly and placed his boarding pass on the scanner. "Morning," he replied. The scanner beeped. Approved. But Everett didn't move forward right away. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a hardcover book, its jacket bearing the title in bold navy letters and his name beneath in clean serif print. Without a word, he extended it to Bryce. On the front cover, a white strip bore an inscription in Everett's handwriting. "To Bryce, whose silence taught me how loud dignity can be." Bryce took it slowly, eyes locked on the cover. His mouth opened, but no words came. Everett gave him a nod, then moved through security, disappearing into the stream of travelers like any other man with a flight to catch. Bryce stood there, holding the book as if it weighed more than it should, his reflection mirrored in the polished tile below. The terminal noise resumed, calls for boarding, announcements about gate changes, the rustle of suitcases rolling across the floor. But for Bryce, everything was quiet. He didn't need a reprimand. He didn't need a crowd. What he held in his hands was heavier than punishment. It was understanding. On the other side of the city, in a sunlit conference room at a regional airline headquarters, Jolie McKinnon adjusted the microphone clipped to her lapel. Before her sat a group of uniformed flight attendants, all of them young, most of them quiet, some fidgeting with notebooks. Behind her on a projection screen were the words, "The day I lost a cabin and found my conscience." She didn't read from a script. She didn't deflect or sugarcoat. She began with the story. Flight 394. Everett Darnell. The choices she made. The silence she maintained. The fear that came not from a man in seat 38B, but from the mirror she'd been handed afterward. She spoke of how accountability wasn't just facing consequences. It was standing in the shadow of your actions and choosing to walk forward anyway. "I was wrong," she told the room. "I knew it then. I know it now. But knowing isn't enough. Change begins when knowledge becomes action." Her sessions became required attendance across several carriers. Feedback forms called her honest, painful, and necessary. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't ask for it. She had chosen instead to earn her redemption through repetition, by making her mistake visible, dissected, and impossible to repeat. Everett never publicly commented on her change. He didn't need to. He'd seen the footage, heard the stories, watched the change bloom not from force, but from exposure. Truth, after all, was not a weapon. It was a mirror. In the months that followed, more than one airline executive reached out privately to thank Everett, not for the embarrassment they'd suffered, but for the clarity. One wrote, "You reminded us that policy without empathy is not order, it's oppression." At a university commencement address, Everett stood before thousands of new graduates and told them, "You don't need to yell to be heard. But silence is not always strength. Sometimes it's a cage. Speak when it matters. And if you're not heard, build the system that makes them listen. The crowd erupted. He smiled, but not for the applause, for the memory. For the day they dragged him down the aisle thinking they were diminishing him, when in truth, they were simply lighting a match in a room soaked in gasoline. He had not planned revenge. He had not demanded justice. He had simply allowed the truth to walk beside him. And in doing so, he had made it louder than all their cruelty. In airports across the country, policy memos now referenced the Ever Clause, an informal term for reviewing procedures to ensure that no customer could be isolated, silenced, or punished based on prejudice masked as protocol. And in every hallway, every boardroom, every cockpit briefing, Everett's story was now a lesson, not in victimhood, but in resolve. The message was not that power punishes. It was that dignity survives. And sometimes that survival changes everything. The end. If you enjoyed the story and want more powerful narratives that dive deep into justice, redemption, and real-world impact, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot twists? Were you surprised by Everett's response? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Your feedback shapes the stories we tell next.